Elia, Finland. I grew up in Laestadianism, which is a Lutheran revivalist movement in Finland. A simple way to describe it would be a more wholesome, conservative, and Bible-based version of Lutheranism. Laestadian families were, and still are, large, and the communal life is much more flourishing compared to the rest of the Finnish Lutheran Church. At the same time, the Laestadian faith was very naive. The Lutheran tenets of sola fide and sola gratia were in the forefront, so much so that faith was usually viewed as something wholly separate from reason. Attempts to apply reason to articles of faith were not met with hostility, but rather seen as something unnecessary and untenable. Faith and the forgiveness of sins was all you needed. When I was a child, I visualized God the Father as a certain type of man. The first mental image was most likely derived from a painting of Bach that I saw when I was very little. Later, that mental image grew a beard and became a bit older in appearance, but I still relied on the simple, imaginative, and emotional aspects of faith. So it would not surprise anyone that when I grew past my childish conceptions of Bach and bearded men on clouds and started to think critically about religious truth claims in my early teens, I didn't have much to stand on. I started to think and doubt. How do we know that God exists? What about evolution and all the other so-called science that explains God away? How do we know that Jesus is God, or that God isn't something else, a being totally alien to my Christian sentimentalities? How can my faith be true if most of the secular wisdom seems to disprove it, and the people espousing my worldview don't even try to step up to the challenge? I wanted to believe. But how was I supposed to think about heaven and hell or the forgiveness of sins if I wasn't even sure of God's existence? Even though the disapproval of Christianity that worldly common knowledge provided was not really anything substantial, it was still enough when contrasted against my own faith. One at least claimed to be based in reason, the other had none to speak of. My childlike idea of a heavenly Father started to suffocate in the vast emptiness of space. After some time of silent thought, I started to carefully ask questions in my community. What I got was disappointing. The answer usually boiled down to, doubt is a part of faith, but we must persevere and believe. On very rare occasions, there was a hint towards reasoning, but even then it was mostly a small, unrelated collection of bits and pieces. This was very frustrating. I realized that the adults around me didn't need rational explanations for things of faith. They had developed a mental shielding and a strong emotional attachment that isolated their religious beliefs from reason, and thus protected them from reasonable doubt. But I had not yet formed this psychological barrier. Reason and skepticism had already made their way into my soul, and I needed a way to deal with them head-on. I didn't find it. Although there was still an emotional attachment to Laestadianism, mentally and spiritually I was checked out. This stemmed from the simple fact that Laestadianism did not even attempt to defend truth on the same grounds as it was challenged on. Faith was something separate, that brute forced its way in spite of what truth might be in other spheres of reality. In a way, faith and its truth claims existed in their own independent dimension. For the next 1 or 2 years I lived in agnosticism. Like many teens at the time, I sought answers from the great Jordan Peterson, particularly his lectures on the Bible. Even though I had not yet realized his intellectual poverty, dishonesty, and borderline satanic thinking, at least what he said about the Old Testament sounded smart and profound. But, of course, it really wasn't very truthful or resembling any orthodox theology. But his sophistic ramblings racked my brain just enough to rekindle my general interest towards Christianity. Then, at some point, I began to discover philosophy and Christian apologetics. As my interest in philosophy grew, my taste for Peterson's ideas grew colder as I began to see them more for what they were, illogical and ultimately inconsequential contraptions that were designed to obfuscate biblical truth and were fueled by a very questionable psychological theory, i.e. Jungian thought. My recollection is not crystal clear since it was a very gradual process, but the first development that I remember clearly was a book discovery, Christian Apologetics by Douglas Gruthwis, which I found on a giveaway shelf of a local library. This marked a new beginning in my understanding, since it finally gave me some of the tools and answers I had been looking for. I found a viewpoint that allowed me to evaluate religious claims from a place of reason. In a way, I had finally found the tools that I yearned for in previous years. The fundamental questions of religion, like the existence of God that had previously felt like impenetrable mysteries, became clear and manageable. I soon found more and more resources to draw upon, classical thinkers like Aquinas, as well as contemporary writers such as William Lane Craig and Vox Day. In my process of discovering philosophy and apologetics, I also started to learn about church history, first tangentially, and then with more intention. I had rediscovered Christianity from the perspective of reason, so I wanted to see it through with the same truthfulness. Which church makes the most sense? Which one is the original? One of the things that had started to puzzle me about Laestadianism was its evident historical disconnect from the times of Christ. I was always assured and firmly believed that their teaching was the pure, original, unadulterated one, just as the Lord intended. I, like most, had just assumed this idea to be true, backed up solely by the emotional comfort and confidence it gave. The connection to the times of the apostles was a retrospectively constructed fantasy that, like the other aspects of faith, existed in its own dimension. Just a second of clear, critical thinking made it painfully obvious that wherever the original church was, it was not anything Protestant. To believe that the church founded by Jesus Christ was able to be wrong for the first 1500 years of its existence, and then somehow transformed into the real deal, is nothing short of ridiculous. Rather, the logical conclusion from that base assumption would be that Christianity was never true to begin with. Soon, Catholicism stood out as the obvious answer, because, unlike the Eastern churches, Catholicism had a clear, historical connection throughout, all the way to Jesus Christ himself. As I learned more and more about Catholicism, to my delight, I was always assured of that thing which I knew to be necessary, that faith had a basis in reason. Not that everything had to be or could be understood solely or completely by reason, but that the truth existed as a whole. It was consistent, and religious truth did not seclude itself from the rest of reality. But this discovery was kind of disheartening, since, even at first glance, the so-called Catholic Church of today seemed quite effeminate. Not to mention the paedophilia and other scandals. There was a strong contrast between what I saw passing as Catholic today and the hardcore Catholic knights, priests, and martyrs of history. And apparently the Church had become a bit more up-to-date, so to speak, through the Second Vatican Council that took place in the 60s. Something was off. Some of the Catholics that I was listening to at the time, such as E. Michael Jones and Taylor Marshall, offered many great insights into Catholic thought in historical times and in general, but did not make much sense when they talked about this change that had recently taken place in the Catholic Church. Their explanations for the Second Vatican Council and its implications were ambiguous and, frankly, incoherent. Luckily, very soon after I had reached my general conclusion of Catholicism being true, I stumbled upon an interesting character on YouTube. Giuseppe Filotto, also known as the Kurgan. Through his videos and books, I discovered something called Sedevacantism. This idea seemed very bold, positing that the papal claimants after Vatican II were, in fact, not valid popes, but rather impostor heretics who portrayed themselves as popes. Not only that, but this had been the result of a long coup by the enemies of the Church, an intentional infiltration into the clergy aimed at perverting and destroying the Church from within, which was made complete at the time of the Second Vatican Council, where numerous previously condemned heresies became official Church teaching. At first, this struck me as somewhat of a tinfoil hat theory, but it was made concrete by the fact that multiple popes preceding Vatican II had repeatedly warned of this very corruption. It was also documented from the enemy's side, namely Freemasons. The secular equivalent would be that if the president of your country repeatedly warns you of an ongoing revolution, and you also happen to find the written out plans of the revolutionaries, well, you better listen and believe. And thanks to the internet, the proposed heresies of Vatican II weren't difficult to find and verify. Besides, the same logical impossibility of Protestantism was present in the case of Vatican II. You mean to tell me that after 2,000 years of dogmatic unity, the Church now has the need to remodel its teachings and practices to something that is absolutely contradictory with what was previously taught as divine truth? Digging into the history, I also learned that these popes preceding Vatican II also tried to secure the Church against the ongoing infiltration by collecting the completeness of the Church's laws into one code of canon law. And Canon 188.4 made it clear that the popes following Vatican II could not, in fact, be valid vicars of Christ. This explanation was laid out clearly to me in an article. Canon 188.4, or Where is the Church?, written by B. F. Dryden and the late Bishop Dolan. The indisputable historical and legal evidence, as well as the logical impossibilities, made it clear that the one true Church was not the one that most people perceived as the Catholic Church, but that the true Church presided in those bishops, priests, and faithful who had ignored and rejected the heresy and heretics of Vatican II. Now I realized that my situation was a bit difficult. Having reached the intellectual and spiritual conclusion that Catholicism, particularly traditional Catholicism or Sedevacantism, was the true faith, I was faced with the practical consequences. I lived in a country that, to my knowledge, did not have any other actual Catholics, not to mention valid clergy. But the truth remained, and I could not let convenience get in the way. Giuseppe put me in contact with Father Steenbergen, an IMBC priest in Belgium. In the spring of 2021, I did catechism with him remotely. In July, I flew over to Belgium and received conditional baptism from Father Steenbergen, and confirmation from Bishop Stuyver. I was 20 years old at the time. I had now become a Catholic. Spiritually speaking, I was a total stranger in my own country. What would be my next move? I already knew that I wasn't cut from the same spiritual cloth that priests were made from, so to speak. I was a young man, ready and willing to find a woman and get married. But how on earth would I go about that matter? I knew that finding an already suitable Catholic lady was not possible, because they simply did not exist within a few 1,000-kilometer radius. I also knew that persuading a modern woman to even consider Catholicism would be a formidable task, never mind trying to wrap her head around the practical consequences of a traditional Catholic marriage. My expectations weren't high. Maybe if I got lucky, after 10 to 30 years of solitude and searching, I could find a woman that was crazy enough to get on board with my seemingly medieval ideals and values. But if there's a will, there's a way, provided that God wills it also. I didn't have much time to lament my oh-so-unfortunate situation. Just a couple of months after my baptism, I met a woman my age, a very fine one, but not Catholic, not even religious. Her conversion is another story, but to make it short, after a lot of doubt, strong mixed feelings, thinking, learning, prayer, and mistakes, I won her on my side. Or rather, God won her on his side. We got engaged in 2022. She got baptized in the spring of 2023. We got married that summer, and now we are expecting our first child. Although we are secluded, with no religious community, and unable to receive the sacraments more than a couple of times a year, the Church has started to grow here in Finland. There's still only a handful of proper Catholics, but with the way things are going, more will be added to the ranks, slowly but surely. I give my thanks and my gratitude, especially to Father Steenbergen for his wise words and constant help, and to Giuseppe for his encouragement and for spreading the message of traditional Catholicism. Most of all, I am eternally grateful to God for his infinite mercy and patience, for leading me to his one true Catholic Apostolic Church, despite my constant sins, errors, and stupidity. I want to live out that gratitude as best as I can.